Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Toops, and I am the Bay Work Manager. Welcome to this year's Bay Work Virtual Training Buffet. This morning, we're proud to have Stephen Maples from Sonoma County Water talk about wildfire and water resources in the Russian River watershed. But to get us started, I'm going to ask, asking everybody to introduce yourself by way of the chat. Please add your name, your agency or your employer, and your title, so we can get to know you and know who's on the call today. And just as a reminder that we are recording the session, so we'll have these sessions available on the Bay Work website and social media going forward. And without further ado, Stephen, take it away.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bay Work Training Buffet session on wildfire and water quality, using the Russian River sort of as our example basin, but it has a lot of parallels to a lot of the watersheds throughout the Bay Area and the rest of California. So hopefully there'll be some interesting takeaways for you all. But before we start, I'd first like to thank Elizabeth and Robert and all the rest of the folks at Bay Work for putting on this training buffet. Bay Work is an amazing resource for us folks in the water industry here in Bay Area and California. So I want to thank Bay Work. The other thing, I really want to make sure that I acknowledge all of my coworkers and colleagues that contributed to this work. So quite a few folks here at Sonoma Water that I'd like to mention. You can see them here. But most importantly, I'd like to thank Michelle Newcomer and Jennifer Underwood. These are our principal investigators from Lawrence Berkeley Lab and from USGS, respectively. And they're the real experts on this topic of wildfire and water quality, and they really helped guide a lot of the research and findings that we're going to be presenting on here today. So I just want to do a big shout out to both of them for all of their work on this. So the topic of the talk today is wildfire and water resources in the Russian River watershed, impacts and resilient management strategies. So let's see here. Okay, so I'll give a little bit of background here about Sonoma Water. So Sonoma County Water Agency, Sonoma Water, those terms are sort of used interchangeably. We're a special district that was created in 1949 by the California State Legislature. Our authorities include wholesale water supply, flood risk management, and sanitation services. I'm an engineer sort of on the water supply side of things. So I focus a lot on our Russian River watershed, the two reservoirs that comprise it, and our goals of providing wholesale drinking water to about 600,000 people throughout the North Bay. That includes Sonoma and Marin counties. Just kind of a quick overview of the Russian River watershed. We have two major water supply reservoirs on the Russian River. We have Lake Mendocino, which is up here in the north in Mendocino County. That was constructed in the late 1950s as a variable water supply storage pool from 70 to about 120,000 acre feet. And we also have Lake Sonoma, which is on the west side of the watershed here in Sonoma County. That's our larger reservoir. It's built on Dry Creek, which is a large tributary to the Russian River, constructed in the 1980s, and it has over 200,000 acre feet of supply. So those are sort of the watershed system that we manage. We make releases from both of those reservoirs to meet minimum in-stream flow requirements in the Russian River and Dry Creek. And then we divert water from a river diversion system and a series of collector wells here where my cursor is. And we then move water through 88 miles of pipeline, 17 tanks and booster stations, and to our wholesale customers, 9 cities and water districts throughout the North Bay area. So So to talk a little bit more about our riverbank filtration system, it's a little bit unique system relative to a lot of the diversion systems that are commonplace. It uses what's called riverbank filtration. And this is a really reliable system that has provided high quality potable water since the 1950s. It uses the natural filtration capacity of the stream bed material to provide potable water. And so basically, here's kind of a schematic of how a collector well works. It has a vertical caisson that extends 60 to 80 feet down into the subsurface with these lateral intake pipes, which then extend under the stream bed. And pumping from this collector well pulls water from the Russian River through that 60 to 80 feet of riverbank filtration system. And it provides a really high quality potable water source that requires just chlorination and pH control. So the natural system is really doing a lot of the legwork in terms of providing the filtration for our system. So here's kind of a more detailed overview of where we divert water from. So you can see the Russian River coming in here and making this big jog through this area that we call Wooler and Mirabel. And we have 6 separate collector wells. 3 of them are on what we call the Wooler side of things, where my cursor is over here. And then we have 3 additional collector wells here over on the other side of the river. And we call this the Mirabel side. And it's kind of 2 separate systems. One of the most important features is what we call the inflatable dam. So this dam is deployed during the dry months. It's inflated with water from the river, allowing a backwater effect to occur along the Russian River, which helps increase the amount of surface area that the Russian River inundates and allowing more surface infiltration of the Russian River to these collector wells on the Wooler side. In addition, when we inflate the dam, it allows for diversion through a network of ditches, basically, to these ponds over here, which we call the Mirabel ponds. And these are additional infiltration basins that allow for additional infiltration of surface water that is then collected by our collector wells. So this system is really important for ensuring water supply reliability throughout the North Bay system. So we've done, like I mentioned before, quite a bit of research with USGS and Lawrence Berkeley to better understand the processes at play, how we can build a more resilient water supply system, and some potential vulnerabilities that we need to keep in mind. So thinking about those vulnerabilities, I'll just give a little bit of background on the fires that have made a huge impact here in North Bay. So this all kind of started in 2017. In the fall, there was this, what they call the 2017 North Bay firestorm. 21 fires occurred simultaneously with a major red flag warning. And roughly 8,000 structures were destroyed throughout the North Bay in Sonoma, Mendocino, and Napa counties. 44 people, unfortunately, were killed, and over $14 billion in insured losses. So this image right here is a pretty iconic one that I'm sure you've all seen. This is of the Coffee Park neighborhood in Santa Rosa, where the Tubbs fire jumped the 101 and basically decimated this entire neighborhood. So this kind of set the stage for the rest of the fires that occurred all the way through 2020. And eventually in our watershed here, we had over 1/3 of the watershed was impacted. So these 2 figures right here, you can see the Russian River watershed outlined in black here. And each of these outlines indicate each of the fires that occurred between 2017 and 2020, and they're indicated by year. So I'm going to talk about some of the differences that we saw in these fires, both in the severity of the fires, their locations, and how those variability impacted how we responded in terms of monitoring for water quality. So on the right here, you can see these really colorful figures that outline the footprint of each of the fires. And you'll see more of these types of figures further in the presentation. But basically, the thing to keep in mind here is that fires aren't uniform in how they impact the landscape. You have areas of relatively low burn severity where it's sort of spotty burning and what they call quote unquote good fire oftentimes. And then you have these areas that are shown here in red, which are really high burn severity where the fire decimates, an entire landscape and it has a much harder time of recovering. So as you can see for each of the fires, the kind of footprint of the burn severity is very different. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And in talking about this, I'm going to kind of split up the talk into two separate monitoring programs that we've conducted. We had sort of a long-term monitoring program that was conducted, like I mentioned, with Lawrence Berkeley Lab and USGS. That's been ongoing from 2017 until today. And it's a very detailed scientific study that evaluates the impacts on the watershed and our riverbank filtration infrastructure. And then we also had a sort of separate effort, which was a rapid response monitoring program that was initiated solely by Sonoma Water. And that was in response to this fire over here, which is the Wall Bridge fire. And this was done to quickly evaluate potential impacts to Lake Sonoma and our riverbank filtration infrastructure. So I'll talk a little bit more about why we decided to do a rapid response monitoring program for this particular fire. So a little bit of background here. As we all know, California landscapes are fire adapted. Fire is just a natural part of the system here in Mediterranean climates throughout the West. But what we're seeing with climate change is that it's increasing the frequency and severity of these so-called megafires. So this is a really interesting figure here, which shows that before fire suppression tactics in the West, fire impacted a lot of the landscape, but most of that was low burn severity with quote unquote good fire that allowed the landscape to respond quickly and move forward. And what we've seen since then is this increase in megafires. And those are ones that have much larger and more long-term impacts on the landscape. And how does wildfire impact hydrology? Well, it does so in a couple different ways. If you look at this figure A here, this kind of shows how watershed flows are partitioned between surface runoff and infiltration. So when you have rainfall in a landscape, some of it runs off, some of it infiltrates into the subsurface and then discharges to surface water. And you also have plants that consume a lot of that water via evapotranspiration. And when you burn it, oftentimes you have less uptake by plants because they're no longer living. And the ash layer that forms at the surface can sometimes be hydrophobic, which changes the partitioning of the runoff so that you have much more surface runoff than infiltration. And in doing so, that can cause erosion and mobilize all sorts of contaminants, things that are directly a response from the fire, mobilizing contaminants from the ash itself, or also mobilizing other things that just happen to be on the landscape. And so here you can kind of see just an example set of figures of how this kind of manifests, with the y-axis showing concentration and stream discharge on the x-axis. And what you see is that in black is just kind of an example of what happens after a fire. Oftentimes you have greater stream discharge and you have higher concentrations in response. So both affecting the water quality and the flow magnitudes that you see. So again, here I'm going to start off with this long-term monitoring study that we have with Lawrence Berkeley and USGS. And this includes, it's just highlighting these fires here, but really also includes the Wall Bridge fire as well. And it kind of hinges on a couple key research questions. How does the interacting fire events, droughts, and atmospheric rivers impact the hydrology, the water quality, and the microbial conditions throughout the river corridor and the watershed? And what percentage of new or cumulative fire is required to initiate change? So that is kind of like, what is the tipping point, after a certain fraction of the watershed burned, you oftentimes will see a response. And the question is, have we hit that tipping point in the Russian River watershed where we've had a third of the watershed burn? So let's see. Okay, there we go. So in this figure here, this has been, like I mentioned, a long-term monitoring program over the past 5+ years. We've collected samples throughout the Russian River and its tributaries, both during the wet season and the dry season. You can see these red dots here indicate sample locations. So you can see that it's a little bit hard to see, but we have, I think, 5 locations here along the main stem of the Russian River, and then 5+ other sites that are on some tributaries that were impacted by each of the fires. And the sampling frequency was greater than monthly. And what we also tried to capture runoff events directly after storms. So we'd go and chase storms, be out in the rain, collecting samples. And in addition, we had a background site, so a location on a tributary on Dry Creek that was, until 2020, was unimpacted by wildfire. And then after 2020, it was impacted by this Wallbridge fire. But by having a background location where we're also collecting samples, it allows us to compare, an unimpacted watershed against an impacted one. And we collected a lot of data. So physical variables are shown here. We have quite a bit of instrumentation at our riverbank filtration site, Wooler Mirabel, that I showed you earlier. So some of that instrumentation was already there. Some of it was new that we installed. So that is collecting a lot of data right at where our riverbank filtration system is. And then at all those sites that I just showed, we collected a number of chemical and biological variables that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail here soon. So for the surface water sampling, we looked at dissolved organic carbon, standard anions and cations, nitrogen, metals, and then also DNA, PFAS, and sugars. And sugars are interesting because it's kind of a signature. There's certain anhydrous sugars that are signatures of wildfire ash. So a lot of samples that we collected, and USGS did all of the sample processing for these samples, and also included some fairly innovative analytical methods that allowed us to have really low detection limits on a lot of these constituents. We also did sediment sampling to try and characterize changes in the microbial populations in the stream bed. So as we all know, the hyporheic zone in the stream bed itself, all the microbial processes that are going on in there really have large impacts on water quality. And what we've shown in our research at Wooler and Mirabel is that those microbial communities have a really important part in the infiltration or the filtration process that we see when we operate our collector wells. We also did ash sampling. So this was to look at, to do some leachate experiments. So these are laboratory experiments where you're basically pushing water with a known amount of some sort of contaminant through the ash layer to look at how ash can contribute or mitigate leaching of certain constituents. We did this sampling across a wide breadth of burn severity. So this picture here is shown at a very high burn severity site where you see a lot of this white ash. And we also did it at other sites as well. So quite a few sample types that were collected. And before I get into the results, I think it's really important to think about some of the context of this 2017 through 2022 period that created some challenges for trying to look at the fingerprints of fire on water quality. And it's really even in, in the absence of the last drought, it can be really challenging to disentangle the impacts of wildfire on water quality from the natural variability that we see. This is especially true in California, where we are very much a boom and bust. From a water supply standpoint, we have really big years. We have then, drought years, and a lot of that is impacted by these large-scale atmospheric river events. So just a ton of variability in the system. And of course, our sample period 2017 through 22 coincides with the unprecedented drought conditions in the Russian River watershed, as well as large-scale floods. So I think these two photos really capture that well. We have Governor Newsom standing in the bottom of Lake Mendocino in April 2021, where he announced the statewide drought measures. And then this other photo here is of our riverbank filtration area that I showed earlier, Wooler and Mirabel. And this is in February 2019, where flooding inundated this entire region here. You know, this isn't that uncommon to get flooding in this particular region, but I think it just kind of illustrates that, you know, we have a ton of natural variability. All of this impacts water quality, and it made it a bit of a challenge to try and say, okay, this impact that we're seeing is only due to wildfire and not impacted by these other things. It makes it really challenging. And so that's where we lean really heavily on the experts from Lawrence Berkeley and USGS. So I'll talk about those results here. So I'm going to show a couple figures here that are put together by Michelle Newcomer, and this is in a paper that she's preparing to publish. And they're kind of complicated figures, but I'll try and glean some information from them. So these results here are looking at if we can see wildfire impacts on that partitioning that I talked about between infiltration and runoff. And it's a comparison between observed runoff and simulated. So using a model with only climate built in and no wildfire, and seeing if we can compare the responses and predicted runoff between those two. So this is using some modeling techniques along with some data, but basically what it shows is that the wildfire has a negligible role on relative to the variability that we see from drought and extreme precipitation on that partitioning of infiltration and runoff here. So this p-value doesn't show that there's significant differences between these runoff ratios. So what that tells us is that, you know, drought and extreme precipitation are really driving the story here in terms of how runoff is generated and moved through the watershed, and that the impacts or the fingerprints from wildfire are small relative to those larger forcings. So then looking at some of the water quality data here, basically what we found is that there's pretty remarkable similarities in water quality parameters when you compare pre-fire and post-fire conditions. So here's some Piper diagrams of various constituents, and basically what you can see is that if all these dots are sort of plotting in the same region, you're plotting pre and post-fire, they all kind of look the same. The water quality fingerprints are very similar. And this other plot here shows pH, and basically you can see that this one's a little bit harder to interpret, and Michelle can do it a lot better, but you know, it's from a statistical significance standpoint, it was very difficult to find significant differences between pre and post-fire water quality signals. Here's another plot that I think is kind of interesting here. This shows the change from pre to post fire conditions, with pre shown in this kind of brown color and post shown in green. And these red dots here indicate if it's statistically significant. So you do see that some changes are statistically significant, but they're relatively small. So for example, you see that there is a change in pH. pH is increasing after the fire, and it is significant, but it's relatively small. Same goes for dissolved oxygen. You also have other, you know, changes that look relatively large, but they're not statistically significant because of the amount of internal variability that you see in those samples that were collected. So again, it's a lot of data. It's really noisy data, and had to be pretty savvy in terms of how we interpreted the data to make sure that we're understanding all the different contributions of variability that we see throughout the watershed. But the main take-home message is that there's very little impact. Here's an interesting one that I think kind of captures this. So these are box and whisker plots where the concentration of nitrate is shown here on the y-axis, and then we have different ways that we sort of sliced and diced all the data. So if we just look at groundwater data shown here in red, this is all of the historical groundwater data that's been collected in the watershed pre-wildfire. And then this plot right here is shown for after wildfire. And what you see is that obviously we have a lot fewer data points that were collected, but they all fall well within this range of the historical variability that we've seen. The same plot is shown over here for surface water. So in this kind of yellow color, you can see all of the variability that you see for nitrate throughout the watershed. And each of these are 1 year post-fire and then 2 years post-fire. And really, it's hard to see, what you see is that all of these data points fall within the range of historical variability that we saw before fire occurred on the landscape. Each of these plots, as you move to the right here, is an increased fraction of the landscape that was burned for each of these sites. And so you do see a trend that as more of the landscape burns, you see some increases in nitrate concentrations. But again, it still all falls within the historical range that you had already seen before. So you do see some impacts, but relative to the natural variability of the system, it's still within that range. So the conclusions of this study is ongoing. We're working on the data collection portion of this has ended, hopefully, unless we get additional fires, which it seems like this season, fortunately, we don't have any additional fires, knock on wood. But I'll walk through some of the conclusions here. Is that this wildfire has imposed a limited and potentially negligible effect on the hydrologic, chemical, and biological signatures in the watershed. These results suggest that wildfire impacts are sort of secondary to the dominant climate and storm conditions. And this demonstrates the resiliency of the watershed to wildfire impacts. This is likely because this is already a wildfire adapted system. And this system, even though we've had 1/3 of the watershed burn since 2017, it still hasn't reached that tipping point for where we see significant impacts from wildfire on water quality. There have been other watersheds elsewhere throughout the West where you have seen those impacts, and you have seen that tipping point has been met, but in this watershed, we haven't seen it. And it's important to remember that drought may have masked some of these impacts, given that when water is depleted from the landscape, it can take longer for those signals to kind of propagate through the landscape and be seen. So, if we transition out of this drought cycle into a wetter period, we'll have to be mindful of that and continue to collect data and interpret data and make sure that these impacts aren't, so we understand these impacts. Okay, so that was a summary of our sort of long-term monitoring project with Lawrence Berkeley and USGS. Now I'm going to talk about a sort of rapid response monitoring program that was initiated by Sonoma Water. This was done to quickly evaluate impacts to our one of our reservoirs and our riverbank filtration infrastructure. And so here's kind of a zoom in on the Walbridge fire, and this occurred during 2020 in August during that anomalous lightning event that occurred and kicked off a bunch of fires throughout the Bay Area. This fire was a little different than a lot of the other ones that we had seen in previous years. The other fires were so-called wind-driven fire events. This is where we have red flag warnings with typically kind of offshore wind events that are super dry and high wind velocity that allows fires to move really quickly through the landscape. And the Wildbridge was a little different in that it was a lightning sparked wildfire, and it didn't have those same high wind conditions. So the fire moved through the landscape a bit more slowly and had different sort of magnitude of burn severity throughout the watershed, which was we think was somewhat important in how the impacts were sort of manifested. But you could see why this one was something that we really wanted to make sure that we were able to have a rapid response to understand whether and how the wildfire would impact water quality, because this fire was directly in the watershed of Lake Sonoma, which is our largest water supply reservoir. It's also very close to Dry Creek in the Russian River and our diversion facilities here. So unlike the other fires, which occurred further up in the watershed and further away, this one was sort of right on top of like two very important pieces of infrastructure for Sonoma Water. So we wanted to make sure that in addition to studying it with USGS and LBNL, we were able to quickly ascertain if there was any risks to our water supply system. So this is kind of a busy figure, I understand that, but I wanted to show it here because it shows the burn severity of the Walbridge wildfire, along with the sampling locations that we collected water quality samples at. So we collected samples at 4 tributary creeks, also collected them on Dry Creek here, and at our diversion facilities on the Russian River. And so we had 3 sampling events. Like I mentioned, this fire occurred in August. And so what we wanted to do is, before we saw the first rains, we wanted to go out there and collect samples to get sort of a quote unquote background condition in those watersheds before any of the ash had been mobilized from the first rainstorm. So that gives us sort of our background data. And then we also wanted to get the first flush event. So that's like the first storm event, even if it's a relatively small storm event, if it generates runoff and is mobilizing ash and other constituents, we wanted to make sure we captured that right away. And then we had an additional storm event. We had planned to collect an additional sample, 2 additional storm events after the first flush, but this 2020-2021 winter season was the driest on record in many ways. And so we didn't see more than one significant storm event that we were able to sample. So, and I'll talk about that a little bit here in a couple slides about how, the drought may have been a blessing in disguise in some ways for mitigating impacts of the Walbridge fire, because it allowed the landscape to recover without any sort of large scale, big runoff event that generated a lot of erosion and water quality issues. So we looked at quite a few constituents, but it wasn't as thorough as our work with Lawrence Berkeley and USGS. So we're looking at nutrients, carbon, major ions, trace metals, surfactants, so looking at PFAS again, and then general physical parameters. So I'll show some photos here. This was our sample collection on the background. So this is pre-runoff. And this was really interesting because we're going into these small tributaries that are typically ephemeral. So they typically dry up during the summer and fall seasons. And what we saw is that after the fire moved through the landscape, we saw increases in base flow in a lot of these tributaries. And some of them initiated flow in portions of these tributaries that were dry. So that was a really interesting finding, because as we hypothesized, is that you burned a lot of the landscape, a lot of the evapotranspirative demand from these plants throughout the watershed shuts off. And so rather than that water going to contribute to these plants, it is then discharging into these tributaries. So you actually see, as a response to the fire, this kind of uptick, a small uptick in the amount of water that's flowing through these typically dry watersheds, which was really interesting. So we collected background samples here, and again, this is mostly going to be groundwater discharge to surface water. So the chemical signature is a little bit different than what you see after a storm event, where it's mostly water from precipitation. Here's the first flush runoff event. So like I mentioned, we wanted to capture the first storm event that mobilized anything off of the landscape. And as you can see here, we only really saw increases in turbidity and sediment loads in one of the tributaries in this particular area. So as I'll show in some of the data, we really didn't see a whole lot of impact. And then we had our second runoff event, which was much larger. And here you can see that this, this is typical for a lot of our watersheds, where even in the absence of fire, you're seeing a mobilization of, fine particulate matter and other suspended sediments. So, this is a pretty typical response that you would see in a lot of these landscapes. You're not seeing, big debris flows or mobilization of large scale erosion or landslides or anything like that. So fortunately, we didn't have any of those impacts in any of these watersheds. So I'll show some of the data here. This is all draft data. So basically a very similar story to what we saw with our study with USGS and LBNL is that we really didn't see any major impacts. So here I'm showing just some selected physical parameters. The problem here, and something that's different than our study with USGS and LBNL, is we only have 3 kind of data points. And so it's, again, we had a hard time with many data points to come up with statistical relationships between wildfire and drought and atmospheric rivers. And here we only have 3. So it can be really difficult to look at any sort of statistical significance, but we can look and see, oh, are we seeing like, boom, a huge spike in some sort of constituent that causes concern? And we didn't see that. So we really see very little differences from baseline and for our first flush and for our second event. So this was really good news. And again, this was a rapid response event. So we were getting results from the lab back within less than 5 days from when the storm event occurred. And so what we did is we quickly, collected these samples, ran them, and did an initial data interpretation just to make sure that we weren't seeing anything out of the ordinary in the watershed. And really, we weren't. So here's selected anions and metals. And again, here you see a little bit more variability and maybe some increases in the second event relative to the first flush and the baseline for some constituents. But again, if you look at these numbers relative to the amount of variability that we typically see and some of the increases that you would expect from a regular storm event system that mobilizes material naturally, we really didn't see a significant event. So again, this hard to draw some statistical inference from this, but really we didn't see anything outside of the range of what we would normally expect. So that, again, that was a really good result. So the conclusions from this study, just make sure I'm on time here. This rapid response sampling event was really successful in characterizing the watershed water quality quickly after runoff events. We were able to get a turnaround sort of snapshot of the impacts on the watershed within a week, which was really helpful for us to try and understand what those potential impacts are. And the Wallbridge fire really didn't cause any water quality impacts that may pose threats to our water collection facilities at Sonoma Water. Again, we see a lot of natural variability in water quality in the watershed just in response to storms, even without fire impacts. The surface water quality variability, like I just mentioned, is pretty typical. And it's important to mention that we didn't see any measurable change in water quality within our collector wells. And I think it's important to point out that all of these samples that we were collecting are in the watershed. This is in surface water, and it's sort of before it goes through the natural filtration into our collector wells. And those collector wells turned out to be fairly robust, and we didn't see any water quality impacts in our collector wells. So that again is a good result, indicating that our system is again robust and resilient to these pretty significant changes in the watershed due to wildfire. But it's important to note that water year 2019-2020 was one of the driest actually this should be 2020-2021, excuse me. It was one of the driest on record. So it could have been somewhat a blessing in disguise, and it allowed the landscape to recover and maybe mitigate some large scale erosion events or landslides that may have occurred if there was, you know, a super wet year that followed the Wildfire. So that's sort of the takeaway messages from our rapid response effort. And to kind of wrap things up here, I want to just kind of talk about the pros and cons of each of these sampling campaigns. So first, I'll talk about the USGS and LBNL study. You know, we have over 14 years of research experience with our colleagues at USGS and LBNL. We've done a lot of research to better understand our riverbank filtration system, and demonstrate its resiliency to environmental impacts. And this was just a sort of another component of that demonstrated, you know, that this is really cutting edge, highly detailed study to evaluate these long-term watershed impacts. A lot of data analysis and interpretation from these leading scientists like Michelle Newcomer and Jennifer Underwood. So the cons, you know, it's expensive and it's labor intensive, and there's, you know, we don't get that sort of rapid response snapshot of what's happening in the watershed. Typically we'll collect samples and we won't see results from those samples for anywhere from 2 to 6 or more months. So this isn't sort of, this isn't something that you can use to quickly characterize any sort of rapid response that you need in the watershed. The other thing to note is that the analytical methods, like I mentioned, differ from sort of the standard EPA methods. And so in some ways I was a pro that we had really low detection limits for some constituents that allowed us to really better understand some of the processes. But the flip side is that sometimes it kind of made comparison of the analytical results from USGS study with the standard EPA methods that we used from a commercial lab for our rapid response campaign. It made data in comparison a little bit more challenging. So going to our Wildfire rapid response campaign, the pros, you know, we were really able to quickly characterize watershed impacts, and it was relatively inexpensive, and we were able to operate and manage this program entirely internally. So, you know, the Wildfire occurred and we were out there within a month with all of our sample locations selected and collecting samples, and then we were able to mobilize quickly and get results quickly. And, you know, that was really helpful. The other thing is we sort of taken, you know, a post-mortem from that rapid response effort and developed some protocols and standards for how we would do that type of analysis in response to future fires. So it was really helpful in sort of setting the stage for inevitably when we have another fire that we feel like we need to really quickly ascertain the impacts, we can go learn from this Wallbridge rapid response effort and quickly implement something similar to respond. So the cons, it's a limited sampling suite and doesn't provide that detailed picture like the USGS and LBNL long-term study. The other con is that, you know, it's internally operated. So we have to mobilize our staff to you know, kind of drop whatever they're doing and go out and do sampling for that day. So in some ways it is nice to work with our colleagues at USGS and LBNL because they can go, you know, it affords us a little bit more flexibility in staffing. And like I mentioned, the analytical methods differ from the USGS, so it made data in comparison a little challenging. And then of course we only had 3 sample events, so it's not enough to draw some really robust statistical inference from it. It really is just sort of a scoping analysis to say, hey, is this way outside of the range that we would expect? Is it something that we need to worry about? Basically what we found is no, we didn't really see those types of impacts. So here's our final sort of take-home messages. The Russian River watershed, like many California watersheds, is fire adapted, and it's remarkably resilient to fire impacts on runoff and water quality. And like I mentioned, there's been significant vulnerabilities that have been documented in other watersheds, mostly outside California. But the Russian River really hasn't crossed that as yet unknown tipping point where we would see significant impacts. So that tipping point is likely out there somewhere. in terms of the fraction of the watershed that would need to burn in order to see impacts, but we haven't seen it. And importantly, you know, climate change has changed the fire regime throughout the West. Even though these are fire adapted systems, water agencies must be prepared for the increase in mega fires and their potential impacts on runoff and water quality. So that's kind of the three take-home messages here. I wanted to end with this photo because I think it's kind of really interesting and in some ways really inspiring. So this is a portion of the Wildfire that was under a high burn severity. This is kind of a monoculture stand, or was a monoculture stand of redwood trees. And this was an ash sampling event that was after the fire, before there was any rain that landed on the landscape. So it was totally dry. And what you're seeing is that, you know, the landscape is already rebounding within weeks. So you're seeing these vivid green shoots coming up through this ash. I think this is a really nice take home message that just demonstrates the resiliency of our watershed and much of California and the Bay Area's watersheds to wildfire. And so I'll end it there. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And I'll open it up to any questions here.
So there's so first of all, we've put a link to the survey for this presentation in the chat. So please share your feedback with us. And there is one question in the chat. Let's see, from Minerva. Did you test for changes in DDPs, TOC levels, and turbidity? What are the PFAS's results look like? Any benzene analysis? Were soil and filtration bed samples also analyzed?
Yeah, so I'll try and take each of these kind of stepwise here. So for disinfection byproducts, total organic carbon and turbidity, we did test for total organic carbon and turbidity at all of our sites. So we have all those data. We also collect data for turbidity within our caissons. So within the collector wells themselves, we didn't see any impacts on turbidity in response to any of the fires. And for PFAS, we collected data for PFAS and we didn't see any impacts from PFAS. And we didn't do benzene analysis. So that's something I didn't really touch on here, but you know, for most of these fires, we weren't really looking at impacts from burns within an urban landscape, which I think is where you would expect more impacts from things like PFAS and benzene. These were sort of wildfires that were in mostly unincorporated portions of the landscape. And so we're looking at ash contributions that reflect sort of the natural wildfire impacts on the landscape, as opposed to you know, wildfire impacts on urban setting. So I know there was a separate effort to look at water quality impacts in the city of Santa Rosa and other areas, but that was sort of separate from this study. But I think that's an important point, is that depending on the type of impacts that you're seeing in your landscape, it's really going to drive what type of constituents that you're going to be sampling for. So that's a good question. Thank you. I see another question about PFAS here, and I'll just re-emphasize that, is we didn't see for our Walbridge fire study, we didn't see any impacts, I don't believe, on PFAS. And so yeah, for both studies, PFAS was basically shown to be a non-issue.
And Mark, you have your hand raised.
Hi, yes, thanks. First of all, thanks for the very interesting presentation. And just in Sacramento, we have been over the last few years doing a spin on first flush monitoring at our treatment plant intakes, and in a likewise fashion, haven't seen a lot of real impact. We're continuing to work our program under the thought that maybe we need to develop a significant number of data points before we can draw any actual conclusions. And I just wonder, are you going to continue to monitor first flush events as you've done here?
So we're still, the monitoring as part of the USGS and LBNL program is ongoing. We've discontinued our rapid response program that was sort of internally developed. So we are capturing those first flush events with USGS and LBNL because we go out and we sample after storm events, but we're not doing it in sort of that rapid response fashion. So we thought we'd prefer to do it with our long-term study with USGS and LBNL so that, just like you mentioned, we can get enough data points to get some statistical significance in the data that we're seeing. So yeah, to answer your question, yeah, that work is ongoing, but yeah, our sort of rapid response effort in response to the wildfire is no longer ongoing.
Thank you.
And then there's another question in the chat about rainfall precip triggers. Did you use those for launching a post-fire sampling event?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, like I mentioned, for the Walbridge rapid response, we would go out there after sort of any rainfall event because we really wanted to make sure we were capturing things, but because it was such a dry year, we were getting runoff generated in some of those small tributaries, but by the time it made it out into the flat Dry Creek Valley, it would infiltrate and wouldn't even make it to Dry Creek. So we weren't seeing any surface water continuity all the way out to the Russian River for a lot of those events. And for our study with USGS and Lawrence Berkeley, we had it was kind of a evolving process. It wasn't really based on like a precipitation intensity threshold. We used predictions from the California Nevada River Forecast Center, CNRFC, and had sort of threshold values that we had developed for those prediction points throughout the Russian River watershed. So if flows were anticipated to exceed some threshold value, then we would go out and do sampling. I think for the Russian River, that was the sort of like standard was about 1,000 CFS. But if we saw, a localized impact on one of the smaller watersheds that maybe didn't meet that threshold, but it did in that small watershed, we would still go out and sample it. So we didn't really use precip, but it was sort of all wrapped up into this modeling tool that we use to kind of come up with those thresholds. So that's a really good question.
And then Minerva had another question in the chat. I see you analyzed for metals. Did you have an established baseline for metals prior to the fires? And most interested in aluminum levels?
Yeah, so Minerva, feel free to reach out to me after this. We can follow up and chat about that. Off the top of my head, I'm not really sure what our baseline was for aluminum, but I'd be happy to chat with you about it and talk about our data in more detail.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much again, Stephen, for your presentation and great report, and I guess a lot of good news in your report. So that was good to hear. But clearly a lot of interest in this because it certainly seems like it's something that more water agencies are dealing with now and will need to deal with in the future.
Absolutely.
Just another reminder to please give us your feedback on this presentation. Here's a link in the chat. You'll also, by the way, get an email reminding you to fill out the survey as well. So thank you all. And we still have 7 more sessions for the training buffet. So please feel free to, if you haven't already, register for other sessions that are happening later today and tomorrow. Thank you all.
Thank you. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to field any questions based on the discussion today. Thank you.